Welcome, everyone. My name is Bernard Hoekman. I'm in the Schumann Center in the Global Governance Program of the Robert Schumann Center. And it is a great pleasure for me to chair this session on the untold story of the Korean film industry, a global business and economic perspective. We have two speakers today, and I guess Professor Messerlin will give us a bit of a background on the project that is really generating the material that they're going to be presenting here today. So this has been a multi-year project, really asking the question which you have on the title of the program, which is how in the world did Korea become a major player in the film industry globally? And in particular, I think one of the things the project organizers were interested in looking at is what explains success, given that a lot of countries have actually pursued a range of policies trying to promote exports of cultural products, cultural industries. Korea is clearly a very successful example, but we also have lots of examples that have not been that successful. So I'm really interested in hearing about the project and the findings. The way it's going to work, we're going to have two presentations, one by Professor Messerlin, who is going to be followed by Jimin Park, who is going to kind of continue on telling the story. And then we're going to have two discussants, Bastien Merson, who is going to be online, who is on Zoom, and then Martina Ferracane, who is here in the room. And then we open it up for questions and answers. So Patrick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bernard. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you for your invitation and for your support during these last years on this project. This has been a project launched by the Academy of Korean Studies and who wanted to know about the comparison between Korea and the other countries. So we have two presentations. I will focus more about the international background and Jimin will focus about the Korean case. But both presentations are based on the book that we just published. So I will be the voice of the book, if I may use this, this expression. Okay, so it may be better for me to go further because I cannot. Yeah.
This thing doesn't work?
No, this thing works perfectly well, but my eyes doesn't work. That's something different. So the first thing in terms of introduction is the what will be an interesting, well-balanced film policy, and we have to define quickly what is a well-balanced film policy. This is a policy which
you want to move a little closer?
Yeah, maybe could be easier. This is a policy which enhances the cultural creativity of a country, and which ensures that this goal has been achieved in an economic, efficient way. So our position is beyond the traditional fault line, especially in Europe, between those who believe that culture is the matter of the state is the legitimate protector of the film industry, and the position which is often taken in the US. This is the business of the firms, and the firms should have really their view and freedom to do what they want. And in fact, what we found very interesting, we were surprised by the results, is that the Korean film industry and policy is the first live experiment. It has happened. It's fact. It's not a question by the economists, which has been a good balance over these 40 years between the respective roles of the government and the companies. And this good balance has been critical for the success of Korea in the film industry. In other words, we suggest that Korea is a benchmark for the countries which want to build a film industry, mostly developing countries, and for countries which have a film policy, but a very inefficient film policy. And as I am French, I can take the privilege to mention especially France, which has a very, we understand by the Korean example why the French policy is so inefficient. Oops. Next slides. Okay, that's it. Okay, everybody knows now that Korea has big success, Psy, BTS in the music, popular music, Parasite in the film, and the Squid Game, the last one in drama. But very few people are aware that this very episodical success are based on an industry, on a powerhouse. And that's very important because you cannot produce only success. You have to have a long series of products. One of them will be big success, many of them will be forgotten, but you have to have this permanent flux of product. In the film industry, there are two complementary, in Korean case, two complementary pillars. The state has adopted a pro-competition policy. No protection on the border, no import quota, diminishing protection in terms of screen quota. There is still a screen quota, but Jimin will really talk in details on these issues. A very prudent use of subsidies. That's the striking contrast with France. And few restrictive domestic regulations because markets have to be regulated. Unregulated market doesn't work well, but you should not be restrictive regulation. So the public pillar is very soft but well designed. The private pillar is the firm companies. And in fact, the companies in Korea are the leading actors. They are generally backed by chaebols, the large conglomerate. Parasite is one of the best case. And they have been able to really produce and distribute as they wish, they organize as they wish. In fact, it's a vertical integration system. It looks something relatively easy to understand, but in fact, it's a very rare example of such a vertical integration. Quickly mention that at the same time that Korea liberalized its policy, its import quota, eliminate its import quota, late 1980s. France did the same, and Mexico did the same. But France and Mexico did two mistakes. On France, they renege on their commitments, and they go back to a protection policy in the 90s. And in Mexico, they made a very misconceived privatization, which basically did not allow the Mexican film production to start. So they have good product distribution, but not production. Now, we want to give you some figures. And here we have the best way to give a quick figure and interesting figure. This is the box office revenues in the film industry. But we have very different countries in terms of relations, so we use box revenues per inhabitant, per capita, in order to compare Korea, 60 million of inhabitants, and China, 1,200,000. And then you can see very easily the blue line, which is the Korea line. It's a very striking example of, after the first arrow on the left side, this is the liberalization of the Korean market, film market, under the pressure of the Americans, elimination of the import quota. Then you have, during a decade, some hesitation, we'll come back there. And then at the late 90s, suddenly a boom, which has been until today. And this is really strange, interesting, it was really surprising us. The Koreans are, in terms of box office per capita, as high as the US, the Americans, the highest in the world. Just for the sake of an interesting aspect, see that the Americans, after the, oops, okay. The Americans, after the 2000, they have a declining box office revenue per capita in their own country. That explains why the US majors were so adamant to open the foreign markets, and especially to go back to Korea and ask, eliminate your screen quota. not the import quota, which was done in the late 80s, but the screen quota. So what you can see here is that the Koreans have outperformed all the other markets and in the large film markets. If you want to go a little bit further, we decompose the blue line of the previous slides in two subcomponents. The red lines, this is the Korean box office revenue for the Korean films, domestic films. And the green line, this is the box office revenue in Korea for the US. And yet, what you can see is that in the 90s, basically the US were going very well. The market has been opened by the Koreans, so the US major could really export more. And on the contrary, in the same period, 90s, the Korean film industry suffered a lot. Why? They have to be completely to readjust to a new open market. So all the Korean films which existed before 88 disappeared. And then you need a decade of entry of new companies, basically these chaebol subsidiaries, which have taken over. But these people have done that very, very seriously. They have learned, they go to the US and they learn how to make a modern movie. So they have a long period, decade of and beginning to understand all the tricks that you have to know to make a modern movie industry. So that takes time. It's an adjustment, industrial adjustment. When they understood that, the things are going better. One interesting aspect is that, in fact, this curve, you know, the red and green curve, they overlap permanently. It represent, illustrate a very intensive competition in the Korean market. Because you don't export a lot of films. That's not true. That's the case only for the US major. For most of the countries, almost all the countries, your competition is in your domestic market with the foreigners. So you need to have a very intense competition in your domestic market. And that was what the Korean succeeded by the opening their market to, so that allowing the Korean citizens to look at all the films they could look at. In fact, if you want a very quick point, is that there is Mickey Lee. Mickey Lee, this is a name I put in the slide. This is the producer of the Parasite. And at the Los Angeles award, she thanked the Korean consumers, moviegoers, very, very, very harmful, very, very strongly. I don't see any French producer thinking the French moviegoers. It's not in the genes of they have understood that. On the right side, I don't have much time and I should go further. You can see the diagram, the same diagram for the French movie, the movie market, and you can see this is a flat brain. Nothing happened. Nothing serious. Quickly, you may say, oh, this is comparing France and Korea. This can be biased. And you can see that I could compare France, other countries with Korea. This is the same thing. Now, quickly, because Jimin will talk about number of films, very frequently people judge the quality of an industry about the number of films produced. And that's wrong, not wrong, but it's a very dangerous indicator. You have to be careful. In fact, on the diagram at the top, you can see the two policies in France and in Korea. The blue line is always Korea. And you can see in terms of number of films, the blue line is going down, you know, for a decade, for years and years and years. The Koreans have produced less and less films. On the contrary, the red line, the French are, after re-protecting their market, they have produced more and more films. So very frequently in France, the people say, we are very good because we produce a lot of films. But it's a wrong, and when you say that, it's a wrong use of the indicator. And you have the bottom, this is the box office revenues per film. So in some sense, it's a more correct indicator. And you can see for the Korean line, after the 2000, the box office revenue per film is booming. So it means that on average, you have more and more success and more large success in Korea on the domestic film. On the French way, you have less and less box office revenue. So in a nutshell, the larger number of films does not count. What counts is the attractiveness of the film. And in fact, the Koreans have increased the attractiveness of their film. And that's important. Now, 1 minute of relax. This is a cartoon. I'm not responsible for this cartoon. Basically, the guy say, that's it, we have received subsidies. That goes in France. Huh? It describes the situation in France. We have been able to hire stars, we can begin shooting. And then the woman was asking the question, do we have a good script? And the producer say, no, what for? That's the trap of the subsidies. You get subsidies, but you don't get good script automatically by the subsidies. And this is maybe the most extraordinary exception of the Korean case. It's a success which has been achieved with very low subsidies. Not none, but very low. And you can compare again the blue line, which is the Korean subsidies globally, and then the red and the dotted line, which is the subsidies in France and in UK. The blue line declined, the red and dark dotted line increase. And you can compare very easily because the size of the market in the UK, France, and Korea is almost the same. So you can just have a very good idea about how the Koreans have very little subsidized their market. If they have don't given a lot of subsidies, they have, as a result, escaped two dangerous difficulties. When you give a subsidies, you create distortion in the market. So it means you favor some firms and you disfavor other firms. You favor one French film and you make a disfavor to another French film to which you don't give the subsidy. So you forget always this bad aspect of the subsidies, which make a discrimination between two companies. The Korean did not have or have less discrimination of this type. And second, over time, when you give more and more different types of subsidies, these different types of subsidies can be completely inconsistent among themselves. If we have time during the discussion, I could show you what we have worked on the French subsidies, and one French subsidy is making the contrary of another French subsidies. So the government is reacting by increasing the level of subsidies, but does not solve the problem of the relation between the two components. Institution and regulation, this is complicated, but I just want to mention, of course, we know in trade policy and generally policy of this type, we pay a lot of attention to the regulation. One important aspect of regulation, this is the institution in charge. Who is in charge? Not the government. The government doesn't want. The government just wants to say we have a good policy, but it doesn't want to take care about the policy on a day by day. So this is an institution, an agency. CNC, Centre National de la Cinématographie in France, COFIC in Korea. CNC is 10 times bigger than COFIC. Is in charge of many things. So you have a choice. Do you want to have a large, very rich agency, or do you want to have a well-contained agency? And in fact, when you have a very large agency, happens something which is unexpected, which is then the agency becomes interesting to be captured by the vested interest. And CNC has been completely captured by the vested interest of the French film industry. So in some sense, it's not helpful to have an agency which works like that. And an agency should do something very bothering. It's very boring. When I give this kind of subsidy, what goal I want to have, who I favor, who I disfavor. It's a very, cost-benefit analysis. Nothing compared to the red velvet of the Cannes Festival. But that's the way to do a good film policy. Now, last slide. You can say, okay, they are better, the Koreans are better, but what about the film quality of the Koreans? And that was data that we are completely unexpected. We look, you cannot use the box office revenue for that, because the box office revenue, you go, you pay first, you see the movie. If you are unhappy, I'm sorry, but you have already paid. So the ticketing is not a good indicator of the payment. You have been fooled by the publicity, by the marketing, by everybody. So to have a good idea about the quality of a film, you have to go to the ratings. People outside, they go out of the movie theaters and people say, do you like it or do you hate it? So you need to rely mostly on ratings. It's a very difficult game. There is 3 agencies, but one thing common theme which results from the 3 agencies is that all of them show that on average, the Korean films are better rated by the moviegoers than the Americans, British, or French films. So that's, you know, over 10 years, I don't know how many thousands of films, millions of ratings. So of course, it's not the end of the road. You know, we should go further and make further calculation and research. But it's really a striking example of the success of Korean film industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. So again, some clear takeaways that we can come back to. One is the role of the industry itself and this vertical integration point that you mentioned. And the second one is the role of the government, and in particular, this pro-competitive environment and the limited use of subsidies, I think is really striking. So, Jimmy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Patrick, so you explained about the Korean film industry comparing with others. So here, you know, I'm gonna explain what is going on in Korea, okay? So when it comes to Korean film industry, especially Korean films, they usually talk about the government role, or sometimes they said Korean films are good, or traditionally Korea was good, you know, enough to produce quality films or something like that. So basically, you know, if you go over newspapers or websites, they talk about these kind of things. Also, one thing they highlight that is the protection, okay? Well, what I'm doing here, it's a little bit different from others because a lot of people, they just focus on the screen quota, okay? So if you go over websites, they said, oh, Korean film industry is successful because of the Korean government imposed screen quota. So that is all they are talking about. Another thing, when it comes to the Korea-US free trade negotiation, which happened early 2000s, people, they also highlight the cut of screen quota in Korea. And then they said, because of the Korean government decided to cut the screen quota in half, and then this is not really good for Korean film industry. So at the time, it's not only the Korean newspaper, but also newspapers from other countries, they highlighted this kind of aspect. But also, what I'm arguing, actually, you have to look at the whole period in order to better understand what is going on and then the effect of screen quota cut. Okay. There's another important factors which is actually business related. So we're going to talk about these kind of things. Okay. In particular, the Korean film industry is very interesting because in the film industry, usually there are 3 principal measures to protect the industry. The first one is import quota. Second one is screen quota. And the third one, that's the subsidies. So basically, the import quota is like restricting the number of imported films from outside. Okay, this is very important because it's not just about Korea, but all other countries, they do have same thing, okay? Which means basically it is the Hollywood films. It's not just in Korea, but other countries, they are the one who gets a lot of money who has the, the large market share. So basically, a lot of countries, they produce their domestic films in order to compete with Hollywood films. So this is one thing. Another interesting point is it's a Korean War, which happened in 1950, from 1950 to 1953. So during the Korean War, actually, it destroyed everything in Korea. So it was not really good at all at the time. But one interesting thing is that at the time, the US Army, when they do some kind of war, they always try to make documentary. All right. The Korean War was known really horrible in the United States. So basically just few number of American directors, they came to Korea and then they hired local the talent. So basically Korean directors. And then they gave, really well-developed, a machine to take, films. And then also they teach how to make films. So basically, Korean directors, they observed a lot of technology from United States. So with advanced machine and then technology, Korea was able to produce a lot of films in 1950s, although Korea was really, really poor at the time. In 1960s, the Korean government, there was a dictatorship, and the dictator Park Chung-hee, he wanted to utilize Korean films in order to increase or highlight the national identity. So this happened in other countries as well. And then, so they basically know that, the Korean films at the time, they produced pretty good films, but at the same time, the Korean companies, they do import a lot of well-made Hollywood films. So import quota is basically imposed in order to protect Korean film industry by restricting the number of films from Hollywood. At the time, the environment is very different. Currently, if you go to Korea, you can watch and enjoy Hollywood films just like the United States at the same time. Some films, they even release in Korea much earlier than they do in the United States. But in 1960s, 70s, it's very different. Korea was poor, and then they just import Hollywood films like 6 months or 1 year, sometimes 2 years later, which means basically the Korean companies, they know exactly which film was successful in the United States. So they only pick up well-made, really successful films in Korea. So in Korean market, basically under import quota, just regular Korean films are in competition with really, really well-made Hollywood films. Of course, in the market, you can see what is going on. Okay. Another interesting thing is, one of the reasons the Korean government imposed import quota is, although this film industry is related to national identity, however, Korean government was really poor, but they still know that the Korean film's quality is pretty okay at the time. So they said, in order to promote the film industry, they said, if you want to import really successful Hollywood films, you need to produce 3 good quality Korean films. Okay, so basically Korean producers, they were really, really interested in producing high quality Korean films in order to import 1 Hollywood films. But in the end, the problem is like, how you can define quality films. Okay, they said if you go to, if one film received the international prize, and then this is good. Then at the time, although Korean films quality is pretty good, but comparing with films from European countries or Hollywood, the quality was not good at all. So it does not guarantee that Korean films receive international prizes. So at the time, what they did is they created a lot of domestic the film festivals, and then they just give away prizes to this film and that film. Okay, so in this case, they just made a lot of festivals. So they said this is a good quality film, and then the companies, they have some kind of license to import foreign films. Okay, so they said this is not really good, and then we need to change the regulation. And then later they said it doesn't matter the quality is good or not, but just produce 3 Korean films, and then you will get 1 license to import Hollywood films. So the Korean companies, they said, okay, if we produce Korean films from the beginning, we cannot guarantee if this film can be successful or not. So basically, they just produce 3 Korean films in order to have a license to import Hollywood films more and more. So in the market, just really bad quality of Korean films, which we call it like a quota quickies. They were produced, And then a lot of good quality American films were imported in Korea. So basically, if you compare the import quota, if it is really respected in Korea or not, you can see the diagram on the upside, you can see that there's a ceiling. So basically it's 25%. So the Korean companies, they imported under import quota and then it is well respected. However, the difference is the market actually, okay? Although the Korean government was successful to limit the number of Hollywood films imported to Korea, but they cannot control the number of audience because audience, when they pay, the same ticket price, of course, they want to watch really, really good films. So in the market, people, they just go to movie theater in order to watch Hollywood films, which, the government cannot control at all. Of course, in 1985 and 1988, we had two film agreements between US and then Korean government. And then at the time, US government said, hey, I know that it's more like a Korean companies, they import Hollywood films and they make a lot of money in Korea. And this is not good at all, okay? Then they said, well, instead of Korean companies importing Hollywood films, what about Hollywood studios? They distribute their films directly in Korea. So this is what they argue. Of course, the Korean government, they agreed, things with the United States because otherwise, United States, they said, we're gonna do something, against Korea. For example, like against the car industry or electronic, goods. So Korean government decided, okay, well, we're gonna abolish the import quota, and then they allowed, Hollywood studios to direct distribution in Korea. So basically, Korean companies, there's no way to make money because, it's a Hollywood studios, they just do a lot of things. At the beginning, they believed that, whatever they just bring back to Korea and they can make a lot of money, but in the market actually is totally different. Before, Korean companies, they choose really, really successful films, so, they can be successful. But when Hollywood studios just import a film from United States and distribute to Korea directly, actually, they don't care, the quality, they just bring everything in Korea. So before it was really, really good quality Hollywood films, but after abolishment of, import quota, it was, a bunch of different, qualities of Hollywood films. So Korean consumers, view toward Hollywood films has been changed. They believe that Hollywood films are really, really good, but then later they said, okay, there are good Hollywood films, but also bad Hollywood films. So this kind of things changed. Here, I just want to, highlight several interesting points. So basically, I already talked about the competition in the Korean market, okay? So before it was, variety of Korean films versus really good, Hollywood films. But after abolishment, it got changed, it changed a lot. Another interesting thing is like, this is the industry. The Korean companies, they cannot import, the Hollywood films because it's a Hollywood studios, they just distribute it and then they want to make some kind of money. So what they did is actually, why don't I invest a lot of money in Hollywood? I can hire the American director, American actors. So basically with Korean money, they can produce Hollywood films and then they can bring it back to Korea. So this is the way they can make a lot of money. So they did actually. But again, if you begin the film project from the beginning, actually you cannot guarantee if this film can be successful or not. Does not matter if this is produced in Hollywood or not, okay? In fact, they did not really successful. However, by working with Hollywood studios and then Hollywood people, the Korean companies learned how to produce films. This is basically, Hollywood system. They just hire really, really well-known director, really, really well-written script, and then well-known actress, and then they just combine everything together in order to produce films. So Korean companies just learned that kind of Hollywood system. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about the screen quota. This is also very interesting because this is the thing actually, a lot of countries, they say we need to adopt a screen quota that Korean government utilize. So that's, they said. Screen quota is basically in order to guarantee domestic films to be exhibited at movie theater. Okay, so movie theater is a private agency. So usually, they try to show films they can make a lot of money. So if there is some kind of competition between Korean films and Hollywood films, of course, the movie theater, they prefer Hollywood films, which can be more successful than Korean films. Okay. However, the government, they said, no, this is not good. You should at least to give equal opportunity to Korean films. And then for that, the Korean government said, like, okay, you have to guarantee 146 days for each screen. So you have to show Korean films. Okay. Of course, after there is some kind of negotiation between the United States and Korea, and then we cut the screen quota. We say, if we abolish the screen quota, this is not good for Korean film industry. And then a lot of people in Korean film industry, they did a huge demonstration in front of American embassy in Seoul. So initially they tried to abolish the screen quota, but it has been failed. And then they just cut half. So in the end, it's 76 days a year. Okay. Now, another interesting thing is like, people, they believe that screen quota is actually guaranteeing some kind of diversity, but actually it does not, because it goes with the number of days, okay? Which means basically at movie theater, they know that they can make a lot of profits by exhibiting Hollywood films, okay? However, the government, they said, you have to show Korean films for 73 days or 143 days, 6 days, okay? Movie theater, what they do is, in order to increase profits, they show Korean films once a day in order to meet the requirement. But by using Hollywood films, in order to increase profits, they show Hollywood films so many times a day, from 9 in the morning till midnight. So if you calculate the number of exhibitions, there's a huge difference between Korean films and Hollywood films. Okay, so once a day for Korean films, and then several times for Hollywood films. So although government, they required the movie theater to maintain or to respect the screen quota, but it didn't work at all, okay? One thing people, they highlight in the screen quota, it protected a lot of things, in Korea. And the thing is like, because there is a free trade agreement between Korea and the United States, and the US government said, okay, if you want to have free trade agreement negotiation, there is one precondition, which is abolishment of screen quota. So Korean government tried to abolish it, but there is a huge resistance and it was almost impossible. So they just cut it half. You can see here, when there is a screen quota is really, really tightened, actually the whole market is kind of, went down, okay? When screen quota was not well respected or tightened, actually both Korean films and Hollywood films, it was kind of booming. So this is kind of interesting to see. Well, I told you about the free trade agreement, the precondition, the cut. The thing is like, the screen quota cut happened in July 2006. So at the time, people, they are arguing that this will kill Korean films. So here I just show the number of audience for both Korean films and foreign films, and also the number of films, exhibited in Korean industry, Korean movie theater. So if you count the number of films, domestic films, and then Hollywood films, actually you can see there is a huge difference even after the screen quota cut. The interesting thing is actually the number of audiences. The number of audiences for foreign films, there is a little bit of increase, but it's not really considerable. However, there is a huge drop of Korean film audience in terms of number of audiences. You can see that there is a huge drop. For this one, they said, you see, this is the evidence that Korean film industry is not good after screen quota cut. But actually, if you go over what happened after 2009, you can see there is booming again. So that means basically, even though we cut the screen quota cut, it is not really the factor that, decrease the popularity of Korean films in domestic market. In fact, what happened is, since 2000, there is a rumor going on in Korea that, the Korean government tried to abolish screen quota. So the investors, they did not invest a lot of money in Korean films. So this is one thing that, hindered the quality enhancement in Korean film industry. Of course, after, they know how to use, limited fund to produce good films. So, since 2009, with limited fund or, production cost, Korean companies were able to produce really good films. And after that, there's just a lot of investment from China and United States, and then it's just helped to increase the film qualities. Here, one thing I just highlight, you can see that there is a lot of things going on, like globalization. So basically, Korea learned a lot of things from other countries, and then they were able to produce good films. And then also the thing is like, when Korean films were in competition with Hollywood films directly, actually the companies, they try to, enhance the quality of the Korean films. And then this is what, in order to make, them competitive in domestic market. The last thing is like, subsidy. And this is very important because when it comes to film industry, even Korea was able to produce quality films, they always believe that the subsidy policy of France is much better. So without having evaluation properly, they just copy French subsidy system, and they said in order to promote the artistic value of films, we need to receive or we need to adopt the French subsidy system. So this is what they did. In fact, in Korea, this subsidy regulation existed since 1960s. However, Korea was poor, and then it did not have any economic value at the time. They, at least the government perceived that way, so they did not invest a lot of money. But in 1993, they just, Korean government noticed the great success of Jurassic Park, which is a Hollywood film. So after that, they just calculated and they said, hold on a second. The revenues Jurassic Park gained in Korea, it is just like we export 1 million Hyundai Sonata cars. So the government realized the economic power of the film industry, and then at the time they began to invest or give subsidies to Korean film industry. Okay, so for that one, a lot of people, they argue the subsidy worked a lot in order to enhance the Korean films quality and export. And then they said this is the critical factors. However, one thing, if you compare the level of subsidies between Korea and France, you can see there are huge differences. Okay, so France received a lot of subsidies, and then Korean companies, they received just a little bit number of subsidies. Another interesting thing that you have to remember, actually the subsidies, they are for small and medium-sized companies. So if you are a big company, you cannot receive subsidies. In fact, if you know the well-known Korean films like Parasite and other things, usually they are produced by big companies which cannot receive any subsidies from government. Okay. Just highlight several points here. A lot of people, they say that film industry is related to national identity and art and culture, so we need to protect. But if you just go over what happened in Korea, actually it is not protection, but it is more like a competition policy. Second, a lot of people, they said it's culture and art, so culture should be respected. But you can see that even though we commercialized the film industry, but still they are able to produce a lot of good films which have both commercial value and artistic value. When it comes to cultural diversity, which is highlighted a lot here in Europe, they said we need to just protect culture and culture. But in Korea, you see Korean government tried to open it to its market and then try to deregulate a lot of things. Actually, it helped the emergence of Korean films, and which actually is good for really cultural diversity. So you can see maybe you need to think about what cultural diversity is, how you can enhance cultural diversity is. It's not really cultural exception, but it's more like a cultural excellence, which is basically just producing really good quality films. So this is my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jiminy. All very interesting. So we have two discussants, and I'll turn the floor first over to Bastian Mireson. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Depends on the nationality. Who is with the VSOL International Film Festival of Asian Cinema. Bastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As I'm not with you today, I just wanted to check with the audio. Can you hear me loud and clear?
All good, yes.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. Thank you for the invitation. I don't have any PowerPoint to avoid any technical issues. And I'm more ground-based. I'm more the cultural guy, not the economic guy. But maybe I wanted to make a link between all the more economical aspects and the policies we just discussed, and how it translated on the field ground, especially with the film festivals and the representation of Korean movies abroad in the film festival. Very shortly, there were almost no Korean movies before the year 2000. There are many reasons, but really, the year 2000, you could see that something was happening back in Korea. From one year to the other, there have been 5 Korean movies selected in the different sections in the Cannes Film Festival. Whereas before that, there were only 2 Korean movies selected over the whole period of time. So from 2 movies in 60 years of time, we went up to 5 movies in the year 2000, and starting from the year 2000 up until the success of Parasite, and this year actually, there has been no year without a Korean movie selected in Cannes Film Festivals. Actually, there have been selected up until 6 movies a year, which is huge. So one might say that there is a proof that something happened before the year 2000. And actually, that is everything what Mr. Messelin and Mr. Park discussed before, all the measures which have been taken to ensure the success of the Korean cinema. And as a festival programmer, and especially focused on Asia, sometimes it happened with other Asian countries beforehand. I'm thinking about Iran cinema, I'm thinking about Thailand, and some years they were really up. From one year to the other, there were a lot of high quality titles, a lot of huge numbers of titles selected in festivals, but it never lasted long. Whereas the Korean cinema, for the past 20 years, I can choose from so many movies to select them in several film festivals. So actually, it's once again the best proof of the Korean vitality. How would I explain that? Other than just the economic measures and policies taken, I think that the Korean film industry found the right balance between art house and commercial movies, blockbuster. Art house movies for the festival circuits and the media coverage, so to attract a lot of attention, to talk about the movies which are being selected all over the film festivals, who are going on the red carpet in Cannes Film Festival, to Berlin and to Venice. And the more commercial successes for the mainstream audiences, the ones which will really hit the theaters and become huge successes, such as Bong Joon-ho movies, The Host, Parasite, and all the other movies he did. So there's a really important balance between the art house and the commercial. And within the commercial movies, actually, which was really interesting, is that the Korean film industry, they understood the attractiveness, as Mr. Messelin pointed out. The attractiveness not only for the local box office, but also for the international box office. All Boy and the Chaser were big hits within the bloody thriller movie genre. So they put out tens, dozens of same formula-driven movies. They got inspired by a lot of American blockbusters to do catastrophic movies, some more science fiction movies, everything which worked out in the American box office and which would seduce worldwide box offices. Well, they would more or less copy them. So this is a very, very important fact also, the internationalization of their own cinema. The other aspect also is that the Korean cinema raised during the rise of internet and the social media. And there again, Korea film industry actually understood very quickly how they could get out of the country, target worldwide audiences by first promoting, marketing, talking about the movies on internet, and then putting them online as per TV views, or even as free to see movies. I'm thinking about the Korean Film Archive YouTube channel where you can watch 150 movies for free from the whole Korean film industry. So this was something really important, and they always were very eager to feed the social medias about their own products. And then, of course, there was also the Hallyu effects. Koreans are very strong, not only in cinema, but also in K-pop, in the music scene, and in TV, which is really important nowadays. So the whole cultural effort, even seen on an economic level, worked out on a worldwide level and brought up the Korean cinema to the current successes with Parasite and Squid Game. But I also think about the involvement of the film industry on every level, actually, helping, promoting all the directors, and even starting with the film schools. Why are Korean film schools nowadays amid the best film schools in the world? Because big film studios actually invest in film schools. They are paying for high material, so the scholars can do their end of the year movies with high quality material and techniques, which is very rare actually. And to keep an eye on the outputs of those movies and to bring those movies, film schools movies, to international film festivals actually. So there's a whole economy, a whole thinking about how to bring up the successes. The only limits I can see within all the economic measures nowadays is I'm seeing a decline in quality. Whereas worldwide Korean cinema is here, the movies are getting more and more formula driven. It's getting more and more Old Boy, The Chaser, always the same genre, formulas, effects movies. And even within the art house movies, the last 4 or 5 years, actually, the art house movies are declining. Everything what I'm watching, there's nothing new. The more artistic directors are trying to get inspired by Hong Sang-soo. They want to get instantly famous by doing the same things as Hong Sang-soo. So whereas, once again, economically speaking, Korea is there, artistically speaking, it's getting lower and lower. And the only question I'm asking myself, will this economic business model last forever? How will actually the industry renew itself and not becoming another Starbucks or McDonald's of worldwide cinema? That's the only question I'm asking myself. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I'm sure we'll come back to that. So Martina is next. So I think she has a presentation. So Martina Ferracana is a research fellow here at the European University Institute. Martina.
Thanks, Bernard. And thanks for the invite to this seminar. It's actually, it has been very interesting to learn about Korea. I work on digital trade, so I don't really work on audiovisuals, but I think there's a lot on digital trade that can contribute to the development of audiovisuals. And one interesting thing already is that all these measures you talked about, especially the quotas, are very hardly applied online. So there's only really one country or very few countries worldwide that could apply import quotas online, and China is a clear example because there's an infrastructure that allows to do censorship at the country level. But then otherwise, all these measures are very hardly implemented by any country online. So yeah, this provides a different kind of way of reaching out to customers, yeah, without any restriction. And when it comes to digital trade, my first question to you about the presentation is about the role of platforms. Because we can see, well, I myself came across Korean culture first time with the Gangnam Style in 2012, and this has been a first great huge success of having an artist, a Korean artist, reaching out to the whole world. And I was watching today, you have 4 billion views of this video online, and we can see that both when it comes to music and movies, the increase, the spike really came together with the internet revolution. So especially with music, you can really see that there is a pattern there. So my first question is, what do you think about the role of platforms, starting from YouTube, but then of course Netflix and other streaming platforms in the development of the industry, Korean industry? And more generally, since I work on digital trade, I was looking a bit into the overall regulation on digital that there is in Korea. And you have, I want to present two studies, two indexes, which can provide some ideas on what is the general regulatory environment in Korea. And one is the OECD STRI that has developed a digital component. And you can see that Korea has very few restrictions when it comes to the OECD digital STRI, and the index is composed of four pillars, and you see in the all pillars there are only 5 measures that in the country can impact in a way like the digital economy. There is something on infrastructure, the fact that the infrastructure network, there is not mandated vertical separation, but that's very limited to mobile. And then there is some limitation on mapping data, which is interesting when it comes to development of 5G solutions, for example, and which are starting to be very relevant in Korea. Then there is something on electronic communication, the fact that Korea has not joined the UN convention, but it's not really, doesn't have any big impact on trade. And then requirement to have a local agent for data privacy reasons, and the requirement to have an address for domain names. And this can have an impact when you want to have a local domain name. But generally very low restrictions. And the fact that the telecom market is heavily deregulated for sure helps the development of the digital content and also the distribution of this content in Korea. But then there is another study, which is the Digital Trade Integration Index developed by ESCAP, which will be published in a month, more or less. I was part of the study, and we are, as the UI, joining this project and expanding the coverage of this index. And this is the results for Korea. This index goes from 0 to 1. 0 means no restrictions, 1 means very highly restricted. And for Korea, what you see is that some areas which are relevant for the distribution of digital content are very open. For example, telecom infrastructure, and some on data, domestic data policies and cross-border data policies. But then other areas are very heavily regulated. When it comes to content, the issue of intermediate liability, so Pillar 8, in Korea is very restricted. And I wanted to tell you a bit more about what we find in this pillar 8. So generally, Korea is found across the 22 countries we looked at in Asia. Korea is found to be among the most restrictive, not close to China, Russia levels, but much more restricted than New Zealand, Singapore, for example, but also more than Japan. And when we do a comparison with the regional average, you can really see clearly that on one hand, infrastructure is much more open in Korea. So the telecom sector is very liberalized and very open, but on the other hand, the intermediate liability component is very much more regulated in Korea. What is intermediate liability is the regulations which apply to intermediaries in general. So it goes from ISP, so internet service providers, to social media platforms. So this is a pillar very relevant for social media evolution and growth. And here you see Korea ranks very high, is very restrictive. In particular, what we have is, and I have here all the acts which can justify this restrictiveness. You have on one end the fact that intermediaries in Korea are not shielded from the liability of what users do on the platform. So in case users circulate and share illegal copyrighted content, in that case, the platforms are shielded from this liability. But when it comes to other type of illegal content, that is of content which is considered illegal, for example, defamatory content or content which praises North Korea or other gambling or other type of content considered problematic, then the platforms are not considered to be liable for this, for what users do. And therefore they have to constantly monitor what's going on online. And this generally is considered to be a problem for the development of platforms and for innovation. And you have 4 acts which in general impose monitoring requirements on platforms. Together with the Copyright Act, then you have these other 3 acts. Then what we find is also on the Broadcasting Act, which imposes sanctions on platforms if they do not have impartial conduct. It's not very clear what that means. Then there is some regulation on game industry, which requires users to always provide their identity, and this can also sometimes restrict the interest of users to use these services. Then there is one act on newspapers, also online, which prevents any foreigner from owning or editing news online. And then an act on location, which is what I was mentioning also before, on location data, which restricts the processing of location data outside Korea. And these, when it comes to 5G solutions and cloud solutions, can result in restrictions in the future. So my question after this is, what do you think about this if Korea wants to do a step in the value chain and go from being a content provider to become a platform provider? That's it. Thanks.
Okay, so lots of questions. So what I'll do is we have around 25 minutes left. Let me quickly go back to the 2 of you if you want to respond to some of the questions raised by the discussants, but keep that relatively short, and then we'll go to the room and to the people online for questions and answers. So who wants to start?
Since we have to be very, very quick, I pick up one by Bastien and one by Martina. For Bastien, he has this conclusion about the quality is going down. I think since I am in the business of Korean cultural policies, I always hear people saying the quality is going down. It's like professors, the quality of the students is always going down. I think this is normal. In some sense, no cultural industries is supposed to be resistant to the time. it depends so heavily from individuals, directors, actors, etc. And probably Korea has a very good time to have just the right package of the talent at the right time. What the policy, we are interested in policies, what the policy can do is just to free these people when they are available. But we will not do, the film policy cannot make these people. Although Bastien mentioned something that we heard several times when we were talking about film students in Paris, the excellency of the schools in the film schools in Korea. Then for the French students, it was just the dream to be there. One question from Martina, but I think most of these Martina's question should be answered by Jimmy because he knows much better than me. The role of the platform, it's clear that in the platform industry, the Koreans have been much more hesitating than in the film industry. And you can see that during the negotiations of the US-Korea free trade agreement, the Koreans were very happy about the demand from the US to cut the screen quota because they say, okay, we are doing a big favor to you, we cut the screen quota, and then they keep the whole regulation in the broadcasting and so forth. So I think what you point out is really this kind of duality, which so far is visible in Korea. Now about the results for ESCAP, I have to read the paper. I did not, of course, read the paper. Thank you for your comments.
Okay.
Switch off here.
Okay, what Bastien mentioned about the quality, here I want to highlight that, it is the critical issue is how you define quality. I mean, he's saying that the quality of Korean films is getting down and down, but compared to what? This is one of the questions. Well, this is kind of difficult to, determine if the quality is good or not. This is why Patrick and I read for our book, we just, pick up the ratings, from critics and audience in order to check the quality. And then we compare the quality of film, attractiveness of Korean films with others in order to show that this is, getting better than other countries. This is one thing. However, I recognize, because it's not just Sebastian who is saying that the quality of Korean films is getting worse and worse, but also some other people, they argue the same thing. Personally, I believe that this is related to the government policy because, recently the government to clearly see that the emergence of Korean cultural products, and then, Korean government to try to intervene, in the industry, more than before. So I believe that personally, this is kind of hindering the quality because it's not really market oriented, but it's more like government involvement. This is one thing. Regarding Martina's question, this is very good actually. The role of platform, I totally agree with what she's saying, but the one thing, the international platform like YouTube or Facebook, whatever, this is not really Korea specific, which means basically any country, if they want to use, distribute their contents, they can utilize this kind of things. The critical question is not the role of platform, but why Korean companies, they are using platforms. This is the really critical one. When it comes to copyright, because Korea is member of OECD, so we should maintain the same level just like other OECD countries. However, the copyright holder, which means basically the private companies, they don't care much about the copyright. So this is why they are just, distributing, their contents online, and then the consumers, they are free to share this kind of contents. And then this is, one thing that, Korean K-pop, Korean dramas, Korean films, they became really, really popular across the world. This is one thing. Another one, the content provider and platform providers. This is very interesting question. In fact, Korea had something like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube much earlier than, Facebook, American, platform, platform service providers. One thing actually we did have like, the side world or this Kakao Talk, this kind of things, but that it's really domestic, oriented. So which means basically if Korea really had a really good, platform, I guess, Korean content cannot be really, diffused across the world. So this is one thing. Okay.
Thanks. Well, the floor is open for questions, comments. Pralok?
Yeah, thank you, Bernard, and thank you both the presenters. Very nice presentation. I really enjoyed listening to it. My question is to Jimin. The logic that you have given that when there was import quota, then only a selected set of Hollywood films were imported. That's good quality, and that resulted into bad quality for the domestic Korean films. And when this quota was abolished, the bad quality of Hollywood films and good quality, it's counterintuitive and against the economic principle, because in the economics principle, when you have good quality product to compete with, quality of domestic producer tends to increase so that you can compete. On the other hand, when you have bad quality product, then domestic producers become, you can say, careless, and they don't care about the quality, so quality come down. But in this case, it is going just opposite way. So what explains this counterintuitive economic principle? That's the one question. And second, most of the discussion focused on the increasing domestic production, increasing domestic sales, etc. But what explains the greater acceptance of Korean films in the international market? It has suddenly increased, as the discussant said that, Bastian said that after 2000, suddenly even the International Film Festival, it has increased. So what explains that international acceptance? So these were the two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Okay, first, when it comes to quality, like why after 2000 you can see that there is quality enhancement in Korean film industry. This is a good question. Actually, I would say this is related to the JEBA, the Korean private companies, because they just want to generate a lot of revenues, so they invest a lot of money in Korean films industry. Okay, the second, Korean film industry is pretty much open. So basically, as we argue, the Korean films, they have to be in competition with Hollywood films. And then at the time, the only source they can make money, that is box office. So for that one, they have to produce really quality films. But another thing, because we open up, so basically Korean consumers, they are exposed to Hollywood films. Okay, and then a lot of things going on, in Korea that is just like other countries. Okay, the business environment or society, a bunch of things. So basically, when Korean directors, they produce films, they can share there is some kind of common value, the same the inequality in the income and richness, whatever. So these kind of things. So basically, the environment is pretty much the same, and then the competition. So Korean companies, they have to produce good quality films with a lot of money. Okay, so this is one thing that I can say about the quality. Like the first question, you say domestic, films and Hollywood films. This is, I already explained a little bit. Before we can import, not we can't. The companies, they pick up, very well done Hollywood films, and then for that one, in order to import Hollywood films, they have to produce 3 Korean films. Okay, so they just produce it, but the quality is not really good at the time. But later, Korean companies cannot distribute Hollywood films, which means basically they cannot make any money. So the only thing, they have no choice, just producing good quality films, Korean films. So this is, one thing, you can see what is going on. It's, again, there is a distributor problem. Hollywood films, it's already Hollywood studios, and for Korean films, it's more like a Korean films.
Hello, hi, my name is Mariusz. I'm a second year PhD researcher at the Social and Political Science Department. And I have kind of 2 questions, I guess, to both of you, because you've given a lot of explanations kind of from the business perspective and economic and regulatory perspective on the success and boom of Korean cultural industries. But I was wondering, you seem to, I was wondering if you can comment on two other possible explanations of factors. First of them is, I would call, I guess, social factor. Is it simply not, is the reason for the rise of Korean culture industry simply not a result of societal result of a country or society hungry of success and creative, and in this late stage of, I guess, neoliberalism or capitalism, which would compare to, I think, for example, to Hong Kong in the 80s and 90s, or maybe more recently to even Poland. So in other words, yeah, the societal impact, is it simply just not that society is now able to produce that kind of films and therefore they do so? And the second one, I guess I wanted to ask if you can comment on the political sphere, because I think especially Patrick mentioned that there is no political involvement there, but I'm still wondering, is that really so? Is there no some sort of regional or international global soft power aspirations or involvement within the cinema or within the creative industries in general?
On the first question, of course, it's a question of quality. That means all what we say, we have a very narrow field, a very narrow question. What a film policy can do for a film industry, national film industry. So of course, it needs to have a society which is ready to produce films, to have the directors, etc. But if you compare, for example, Mexico and Korea, it's a good comparison, same time, same idea to liberalize, and even Mexico was ready to liberalize because it was, much more market-oriented, and Koreans have to liberalize because the US were putting the gun on the head. But in Korea, the industry has transformed itself so that the Korean skills and society could be involved in the production of Korean films. Whereas on contrary, Mexico, the Mexican producers and directors mostly, had to go to Hollywood. They could not really do Mexican films because in fact, there was no Mexican producers of films. There was only Mexican distributors of films. And these guys, of course, they only want to import US films because that was the most certain return on their investments. So you don't have this vertical integration that you have in Korea, by which the Korean producer of film knows that the answer will be when this film that he has helped to produce will face the movie theater and will face the judgment of the moviegoers. So there is a responsibility of the Korean producers, and because of the vertical integration. And in fact, when you compare, the previous question, you don't compare the same firms. The Korean firms of late 80s have nothing to do with the Korean firms of late 90s. This is totally different firms. Late 80s, they were essentially rent seekers due to the import quotas. So of course, as Jimmy mentioned, take a good Hollywood film, no uncertainty, you are sure to make a big business. And then add US excessive confidence in their own film, and that creates what happened in the 90s, the catastrophic event of the 90s for the US film, no US major. The US major were sure that by inundating the Korean market, they will make a big business, but no, because good films are not all your production. In the US major have a lot of bad films. So in fact, that explains what happened in the 90s from the US film. On soft power, I think Jimmy has just published a recent piece on the soft power of Korea. If I may give an example, I was a good French guy, and in 2013, I was visiting the Ministry of Tourism and Culture, and I was asking the relatively high-ranked official, could you help me to have good contact in the film industry and in the music industry? And the guy in front of me said, if we could have such contact. So that reveals the huge distance between these two completely different aspect, and Jimin will tell you how, in fact, the current administrations, not only the last one, but the current one, but the previous one, they want to capture, of course, the benefit of the Hallyu, K-pop, K-dramas, and so forth, because it's good for them, for their own reputation. I mean, see the YouTube with the current president. I'm sorry to enter the Korean politics, I should not, but see how the Korean president was smiling and happy when all the BTS K-pop guy was in front of the UN. It was for him. Macron, President Macron will do the same things. Of course, there is a political capture of this aspect, but it's not the driving aspect, I think. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Both of them are very interesting. Okay, let me put out this way regarding your second question first, the soft power. It's not just in the Korean government, but also the international newspapers. They already highlight the soft power of Korea by using the Korean content. But one interesting thing is, like, if you know the history of Korea, actually it is almost 2,000 years old. So it's much older than that one France has. And then so far, Korean government was so proud of its long history, and then the traditional thing, whatever this is the main focus for soft power before the emergence of Korean culture industries. Okay, once the Korean government realized there is a huge emergence of the Korean culture industries, then they began to saying that, oh, we are behind the emergence of Korean culture industries, whatever. This is what they argue about. Again, I said this is not the reason, So it is really recent, they argue that, this is the thing for soft power, whatever. Political intervention, of course, there is something like that. But one thing you have to understand that, even in Soviet Union, although there is no freedom of express, but actually they were able to produce really good films. Okay, so you have to understand this. There is something. Also, China before Xi Jinping, they were able to produce really quality films. Okay, and then all of a sudden, government intervenes something that it hinders something. So you can see there's some relationship. So the social factors, we do agree with you. There is some factors that I'm sure about it, but if you just go over Korea, you may say that, oh, Korea became more democratized to be compared with before, or it's more liberal or whatever. You can argue that way, but again, one thing, one of the reasons that we compare Korea with the other countries, we are saying that, okay, we know that although there are some changes in terms of social factors, but we would like to highlight the effectiveness of the factors. So which factor is more effective in order to increase the film quality or film production, something like that. Okay, so this is one thing, and then we figured it out. Let's say Korea has a similar social factors like Japan or other countries, but all of a sudden we can see that Korea was able to produce a lot of good films. So in this case, we focus on policies and economic factors and businesses. Okay.
Thanks. Is there anybody on the Zoom who would like to intervene? If so, I would just say, either raise your hand or just speak up, unmute your mic and speak up. I don't see anything.
Yes, I would have, if I mind. It's Bastian
Yes.
speaking.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Appearing like a ghost, sorry for that. Actually, I'm wondering about the subsidies. So I can get your explanation, Professor Messerlin, about less subsidies make better attractiveness or creativity. As a French infused subsidy person, I'm thinking also about smaller companies, more independent companies who are already struggling a lot, and now there are less subsidies. So how are they still able to make movies in the future with less money? And the second question, maybe, did you also have insight within co-productions? Because in many other worldwide countries, smaller companies or art house companies using co-productions to make their movies. So what is the situation in Korea about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Bastien, for your first question, because in fact, the problem is we always talk in my presentation, I always talk about global amount of subsidies because I don't have much time. So I just insist on global amount of subsidies. But what is probably more important is the structure of the subsidies, the type of subsidies which are given by Korea and which are given by France. I take an example. In France, we give 1/3 of subsidies, we give them to the movie theaters. 1/3 of the total subsidies, 160 million euros per year. And most of the owners of the movie theaters, not all, but most of the owners of the movie theaters are big firms. They are not the small guys. So why we give such a huge amount of money for exhibitors which are members of large firms, which could really earn and make pure competition? We could cut this part of the subsidies, not all of them, part of the subsidies, keep only some subsidies for such a type of movie theaters. The Koreans have done that, you know, art house movie theaters with mixed success, but this is what they have done. Less subsidies, better targeted. And this is a thing we should do. And you know that in France, we have subsidies which are given on the past performance. Is it really an important criteria? So we could look at one subsidy after the other and then check which one is good, has a good impact on the production, and I'm sure there are which have, and which one are really not very helpful for the movie film industry globally, because the film industry is hurt at the end. It's always the film industry which paid the price. You know, if you increase the price of the seat, the tax on the seats, you have less moviegoers. So the movie industry is hurt by the tax system. So we have to think about that in detail, one by one. Jimmy, on co-production, I think you have.
Okay, thank you for your question. About subsidy related answer, I can give you, in person by email. I just cover co-production because we don't have much time. Co-production is very interesting, actually. The beginning is the co-production agreement between France and Italy right after World War II. Okay, the interesting thing is, like, at the time, because both France and Italy did not have enough money, so in order to produce films, they worked together. So this guaranteed the market size as well as the cost sharing. So this is the main idea. Then after that, some reason, the countries, they highlight, cooperation is good for the cultural diversity or something like that. But one interesting aspect, although the government, they usually highlight the importance of co-production, but when it comes to number, okay, actually there's not that many co-production. Okay, if co-production is really, really interesting, then why companies, they don't do co-production in order to increase profit? So this is one thing. The second, co-production, and then the government actually, they give a lot of subsidies for co-production, but this is misused somehow. Okay, a lot of companies, they just do co-production, okay, nominally. In order to subsidy, they just increase the number of the staffs and crew in order to qualify to receive the co-production subsidies. So this is what they are doing. And then there's a lot of misuse cases, the co-production between two countries. And then you have to, there are just so many things, so I cannot explain everything, but I already wrote one paper about co-production. So if this one is led by private entities like companies, this is fine. But when it is led by government, saying that this is for international cultural diversity, actually in this case, this is not really good at all. Okay, and then also several countries like China and North Korea, they are kind of exploiting co-production agreement with other countries, and they just produce some kind of propaganda films, and then this is kind of very common in all other countries. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so we're running out of time. If there's anyone else who wants to ask a last question. If not, let me thank Martina and Bastien for acting as a discussant, Patrick, Jimmy, for the presentations. And I guess I look forward to seeing the book. Is the book out?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So maybe you should do a bit of advertising now.
At a huge price, which support our papers against intellectual property rights, which are captured by the publishing companies and not by authors, I can tell you. But that's another point.
We have this system where we put the preprint versions on the web. So maybe that's what you should do. Okay, thanks again.
Thank you very much.